各位朋友，大家好，今天是美西时间2024年12月12日，星期四，欢迎来到财经林业。那么今天这期节目呢，和大家介绍一个非常好看、非常有价值的视频，可以说是年度必看的视频啊，非常值得一看，建议每个朋友都看一下。它是2024年诺贝尔奖经济学奖得主的一个演讲，它的标题是《制度与繁荣》。演讲呢，1个小时40多分钟，基本上都是有中文字幕的，非常方便大家观看。今年诺贝尔奖得主的主要观点呢，其实他认为国家贫穷还是富裕，核心因素是政治和经济制度，而制度呢又分为2种，一种是包容性的制度，一种是榨取性的制度。而包容性的制度呢，它是保护私有财产，公平竞争，鼓励创新，为多数人提供激励，才会促进经济的增长。而榨取性的制度啊，主要有以下特点，就是产权不清楚，法治不明，权利不受约束，只成为少数人掠夺多数人的一个工具。而榨取性的制度啊，并不容易变革，因为他们会想尽一切办法苟延残喘，除非有巨大的外部力量，或者经营内部分裂，或技术颠覆现有的权力结构，才有可能实现真正的转型。总结来说呢，他认为啊，为剥夺大众而建立的制度不利于长期的增长，而建立基本经济自由和法治的制度则有利于长期的经济增长，政治和经济制度往往也会更加的长久。所以大家结合中国的改革开放来看呢，确实就是这种情况。中共只进行了经济改革，但是没有进行政治改革，这是导致现在为什么改革开放被终结的一个根本原因。短期来说可以促进经济繁荣，但是长期来说没有政治制度的保障，经济啊也要坍塌，这就是中国的现状啊。所以大家可以好好看看这个视频。
Honorable laureates, excellencies, dear colleagues and dear students, ladies and gentlemen. If we look around the world, we see huge differences in income across countries. In some countries, people are mostly rich, and in other countries, people are mostly poor. And it's not only about money. Living standards in general, access to health and education, the level of corruption, and perception of life satisfaction varies dramatically across countries. Why do these huge differences exist? And why don't they disappear? Why don't countries with ill-functioning institutions simply copy more successful countries, which could provide better living conditions for everyone? It's hard to think about more important questions than this. But these questions are also very hard to answer. Are good societal institutions the result of economic progress? Or is it vice versa, that good institutions cause economic growth? Or is it that good institutions, economic and social progress, develops together, more or less automatically, slowly, but nevertheless? This year's laureates in the economic sciences, Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, have demonstrated how important societal institutions are for the prosperity of a country. Lack of rule of law and exploitation of the masses are detrimental for growth, but they can prevail for a very long time. The laureates help us understand why this is the case. A key piece of evidence used by the laureates to establish a causal relationship from institutions to prosperity is built on the fact that Europeans, when they colonized large parts of the world many centuries ago, they dramatically changed the institutions, but not in the same way everywhere. In some parts of the world, the purpose was exploitation of the people and expropriation of natural resources. In others, it was the building of new states to the long-run benefits of settlers. The laureates have shown that the consequences of these differences are still highly visible. Those countries where inclusive institutions were built are now rich, much richer, while the ones where exploiting institutions were built are poor. The laureates have explained that such bad institutions provide short-run benefits to a ruling elite. Although the introduction of more inclusive institutions, less exploitation and the rule of law could provide benefits to everyone, the rulers cannot credibly promise not to steal the fruits of these changes later on. Thus, the society can get stuck in a situation with bad institutions, poverty among the masses and the rich elite. But the laureates have also shown that there is hope. Democratization and the building of more inclusive institutions have happened, and they can happen again. So it's a great honor for me to present this year's laureates, and the first lecture will be given by Daron Acemoglu, Institute Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Please, Daron, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. It's such a great honor to be here to deliver the 2024, one of the 2024 Nobel lectures, in large part because it means we've been awarded the Nobel Prize, which is a fantastic honor. But rather than talk more about my joy about this, let me delve in and talk about institutions, technology, and prosperity. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about how I got interested in those questions, how Simon, Jim, and I approached them, but also provide a framework that I think is useful for thinking not just about history, but about some questions of import today. What drew me to economics can be seen from this picture. Even as a teenager, I became aware that there were huge differences across countries. So, for example, in this map, if you look at the countries that are shown in dark blue, which are the 12 richest countries or 12 richest countries that make up about the top 10% of the distribution by GDP per capita around the world, they are about 63 times as rich as the countries shown in the lightest color. That's a staggering gap in a hyper-connected, globalized world, and it constitutes, to me, one of the most puzzling but one of the most exciting questions of social science. Even as a teenager, I had reason to link this to politics because I was growing up in Turkey when, shortly after the country had undergone a coup and freedoms were suppressed, soldiers were everywhere, even at the gates of our school, and I came to wonder whether political issues were related to the economic problems that the country was experiencing at the time, such as unemployment, inflation, stagnation, and whether they were related to the issues that I was also observing around the world in my little capacity that I had as a teenager. So today we would say that those issues are related to institutions, broadly speaking, property rights, laws, regulations, political arrangements that influence the distribution of political power, who has political power, how that can be exercised, and the distribution of economic resources, which shape incentives and opportunities. You can see on the right a huge variation in institutions, however you measure them. Here I'm using the World Bank's index of rule of law, equality before the law, and you can see some countries clustered at the bottom. I'm showing them in purple, and some at the very end showing in green. We call those different institutions extractive and inclusive, just to have a label. Extractive institutions centrally are those that concentrate economic and political power in the hands of a small segment of society without putting much constraints on it, and that enable extraction of resources, tilting of the playing field in favor of those at the expense of others. Inclusive institutions, so the polar opposite, they distribute economic and political power and opportunities more broadly. You can see a strong correlation with GDP per capita, but correlation, of course, is not causation. In the parlance of economics, we would say institutions are endogenous. It may well be that, as John said, rich countries demand or can afford better institutions, whatever dimension of it you focus on, or it could be that there are some other omitted factors that are responsible, that influence both prosperity and various dimensions of institutions. These ideas go back a long time. Montesquieu was one of the people who eloquently, although idiosyncratically, identified one version of it, which we later refer to as the geography hypothesis. He wrote, "The heat of the climate may be so excessive as to deprive the body of all vigor and strength," and continued, "Slavery is more supportable than the force and vigor of mind necessary for human conduct." From this, Montesquieu concluded that his theory of separation of powers and republican forms, constitutional forms, was applicable to people who lived in cold climates, but not to those in hot climates who deserved and would end up with despotism. So perhaps that's what we're seeing. How can we cut through this quagmire? Well, you need institutions and you need context and you need theory. So European colonial history seemed like an ideal lab for us, not just because it's one of the most formative events of the last millennium, but because, as the figure I showed already indicates, and I'll go back to it, the range of institutions you see in the former colonies spans the whole spectrum. So here, the countries that I picked at the bottom and the top, and they're not the only ones, by the way, are all former colonies. So you see this variation in the colonial sample as you see in the whole world. But also, we need a much more specific theory, in fact, a two-layered theory. First, about how institutions evolve and influence economic outcomes, and secondly, about why institutions vary. Why do you see that whole range of differences in the colonial world in terms of various dimensions of institutions? And that's the heart of what, in a more fancy way, econometricians, statisticians, economists would call an instrumental variable strategy, meaning you identify historically a source of variation that you can then exploit to explore the causal effect of institutions. So let me talk a little bit about that theory in a schematic form. Here is one representation. Political institutions and the distribution of resources are what I call state variables. They come from the past, not in an unchanged form, but they come from the past, and they influence de jure political power and de facto political power. De jure political power allocated by political institutions is who gets to vote, what are the rights, what are the representation, what are the constraints, and so on. But reality is that a lot of politics is not just about what is written on parchment, but it's about the reality of politics, how you form coalitions, how you influence others, how you use military resources, threats, and so on. Unfortunately, a very real part of institutions in reality. And it's the sum total of de jure power and de facto power coming from who is rich, who is poor, who is enabled, who is empowered, that determines collective decisions. And the collective decisions that we most care about are about institutions. Economic institutions are shaped by this struggle. And the red arrow there is what we're interested in. It's the impact of economic institutions on economic performance, something like aggregates like GDP per capita growth, but also who gets the benefits, the distribution of resources in the future. And also the sum total of de jure and de facto political power also shape the evolution of institutions. Institutions are persistent, but they also change. There is nothing historically stasis about political institutions. When we come to thinking about why was it that big variation existed between countries that were colonized by Europeans, we need a sort of a perspective too, and the way that Simon and Jim and I thought about this is summarized in the schema. But here, let me start from the end, ROD, which is the link from current institutions to current performance. That's what we're interested in estimating. Link C, from early institutions to current institutions, is like, how do colonial institutions, arrangements, power, and so on affect the organization of these societies today? And link B was the heart of our theory, or one part of the heart of our theory, which is the co-determination of settlements and early institutions. Europeans settled in some places and set up indirect rule, or just try to rule with a few people there over a large indigenous population. But of course, settlements themselves are determined endogenously. People were more likely to settle in places that offered greater riches. So the approach that we developed was to look for something that would in turn be more exogenous to these dynamics, but still influence these settlements. And that was, of course, the local disease environment. Europeans had almost no immunity to yellow fever, malaria, many gastrointestinal diseases from the semi-tropical areas. So in some places where such diseases were absent, living conditions were more comfortable, healthier than even in Europe. But in some places, Africa, Central America, parts of Asia, Europeans faced staggeringly high mortality rates. So the chain of causation, therefore, is from these local conditions to settlements, co-determining institutions, which in a way that I'm going to explain in a little bit once I provide the framework, then those persisting to some extent to current institutions, and then enabling us to estimate that link D. But the key here is what econometricians we would call exclusion restriction, meaning that this potential settler mortality that Europeans faced at the time was not directly affecting current performance, but it's affecting through these channels. So that's the theory plus data, and in our case that's plausible because the lack of knowledge about germ theory of disease, about these infectious diseases and those immunities, those are long in the past, hundreds of years ago. So now the main channel is through these things. So of course, a hard part of any empirical project is the data. So once we collected the data, we cleaned it and developed some degree of trust in it. So we looked at a figure like this, which you would call the first stage of this instrumental variable strategy, meaning the relationship between the endogenous variable that we're interested in. Again, I'm using the rule of law, doesn't matter much which index of institutions you use actually, and against the potential settler mortality in the colonial era. Potential here I'm emphasizing because in some places Europeans didn't actually settle, so these are numbers from military expeditions and such so on. And you see a very strong relationship here, which when we first discovered it, this was the eureka moment for us. Oh my God, there is something here. It's actually pretty big. So there is some quite high degree of projection of these current day institutions to long ago settler mortality rates. But our eureka turned into euphoria when we looked at this, which we call the reduced form, meaning this is the relationship between this source of variation, potential settler mortality, and the outcome of interest, GDP per capita today, as a result of these cumulative development process. You see a very strong relationship. Almost 50% of the variation is still projecting on these historical variables. And the exclusion restriction that I mentioned essentially says this is all working through those channels that I highlighted, not through some direct effect of this settler mortality. So put these two together, and this is the bottom line. The horizontal axis is again the rule of law index from the World Bank, and on the GDP, on the vertical axis I have GDP per capita. But this is not the correlation that I showed you earlier. It is our estimate of the causal effect of institutions superimposed over this cloud, and it's the causal effect that we estimate through these assumptions and using this combination of theory and data. From the beginning, my interest in economics was in technology, how it's shaped, how it influences growth, including inequality, who benefits from growth. And Simon, Jim, and I realized, of course, one of the major channels via which institutional arrangements mattered was by encouraging or discouraging technology adoption, how inefficiently the economy was organized, and I talk about some of those. But I'm showing two summary measures, again, as the IV estimate using the same procedure that I described before. Again, these are not correlations, but these estimates superimposed on the data. On the left, I'm using a favorite measure of economists, total factor productivity. Look at those GDP per capita differences, but take out what is due to machinery, investments in physical capital, investments in human capital, what's left the residual. That again projects onto the GDP, onto institutional variables, instrumented, exploiting this exogenous source of variation. And on the right, a different measure that looks at the technology composition of exports. What is the fraction of exports of a country that are in products that are classified as advanced technology products by the Census Bureau? Again, you see a high projection. So whatever is working by co-determining technology, efficiency of production, and GDP per capita. So to think about these, what I'm going to do is now I'm going to present a framework, and the point of this framework is to reinterpret our work, including the colonial context, but also help us think more about institutional change and institutional persistence, but also shed light on some questions of relevant today. For example, how we are going to adapt, benefit or not benefit from a slew of new technologies we're experiencing in the context of AI. The centerpiece of this is what I'm going to call the Utility Technology Possibilities Frontier, UTPF, and this is going to describe how various social choices determine the distribution of utility income between different groups. And using this framework, I can talk about factors that shift the frontier, more or less efficiency, for example, technology, factors that move us along the frontier, and the role of technologies, especially in shifting the frontier. But also this framework is going to be useful for delineating the causes of institutional persistence and institutional change. So here is what a UTPF would look like in an extremely simple world with just two groups, which I've labeled poor and rich, just for concreteness. You can think of the rich as the colonialists, landowners, capitalists, or poor as indigenous population, peasants or workers, depending on context. And think of the rich as being initially politically more powerful. The utility of the rich is on the vertical axis, that of the poor on the horizontal axis. So you see the frontier, the downward sloping part of it, which is saying, well, along this frontier, you can either provide more utility, more income to the poor, or more to the rich. So let's get into the details a little bit and think about the moves and shifts and try to illustrate what this actually means. And here I have shown first along the blue frontier a move. There are 2 points there, B and A, and this is the trade-off that I was already hinting at. Point B has higher payoff for the poor and lower payoff for the rich, and A, higher payoff for the rich and relatively lower payoff for the poor, as you can see from the projections on the horizontal and the vertical axis. What does this mean? So, for example, point B might be unions are strong, they negotiate high wages, and that leaves less money for the capital owners and perhaps the managers. But then moves along the frontiers are about the balance of power. If your unions weaken, that means less bargaining, lower wages, and profits increase, wages fall, and that is the move along the frontier from point B to A. But in the colonial period, in our work, for example, in Why Nations Fail with Jim, we emphasize a lot blocking of technology, use of inefficient technology. That's about shifts of the frontier, which has quite major consequences for the capacity of the economy to generate economic growth. So the key is the shifts of the institutions as well as the moves along it, and so institutions shifting the frontier. Why would that be? So hold up, that's one potential label you can give to the fact that the politically powerful groups cannot refrain from grabbing, extracting the income of others in the population, which will then discourage investment, innovation, economic participation by these other groups. This is very much about institutions. Why? Because when they do such extraction, that's a violation of the property rights of others or taking away opportunities, and it is the political institutions in part that determine whether they can do so or not. Constraints on the exercise of power would generate this sort of hold up and take resources from the others. In a lot of our work, we also thought about state capacity, the ability of the state to achieve its objectives, including enforcing laws and regulations. Extractive institutions also heighten conflict, and in doing so, they often erode or prevent the building up of state capacity. They sometimes lead to the collapse of state capacity. That's another channel via which you can get the kind of shifts from the blue to the red frontier, from the better to the worse frontier. Some of my work recently is thinking about experimentation and the building of collective knowledge. Institutions are particularly important in this context, but I'm not going to have much time to talk about it, but I just paid lip service to it. But I'm going to spend a little bit more time on two channels that Jim and I emphasized in our work, which we called economic losers and political losers, which explain how this frontier is useful for thinking about these issues. Economic losers is about the distribution of and efficiency not being separable. They're being co-determined. So imagine we start at point C with the rich elite being powerful and getting a pretty good deal in terms of economics. For example, they control some monopolies. That's inefficient. So you can dismantle the monopolies and the distortions reduce. There's more competition. So you shift from the red to the blue frontier. Or you introduce a new technology. But when you go to the blue frontier, the incomes of those who were previously benefiting from the monopolies, some of the politically most powerful people, will be eroded. New technologies may require new talents, new comparative advantages. It won't be the existing elite that benefit from them. So that might take us to point B, and we don't have the fiscal tools such as lump sum taxes to efficiently distribute these resources back. So if that's the case, from the point of view of the rich elite, you have a move from point C to point B. A good shift, but also losing of your economic rents and economic sources of benefits. And point C compared to point B, and look at the whole vertical projections of these, and you'll see actually the society as a whole gains, but the elite loses out. That's the economic losers mechanism. So the fact that they are going to lose their economic privilege makes them reticent to embrace institutional change or new technologies, or it might even force them sometimes to choose worse institutions when better ones are available. But the problem is not just about fiscal tools. And in fact, the political losers, what we call the political losers mechanism, is, we believe, is more fundamental. So here again, we start at C, the same monopolies, the same bad technology, and better alternatives are available. We shift to the blue frontier, but now the instruments are available, so you don't have to go to point B, you can go to point A. The best of all worlds, both the rich elite and the citizens benefit. But here is the catch. Change, economic change begets political change. This is what Jim and I called in Why Nations Fail, political creative distraction. Some discontent is created that creates political instability, or even more importantly, the foundation of the political power of the elite may be eroded by economic change. So as a result, you expect the flow, you lose political power, and once you lose political power, the same fiscal tools are now turned against you, so you start traveling from point A to B. So the choice may be between C all the time versus A today versus B tomorrow, and if you expect to lose a lot from your loss of political control, you will be in this political losers situation. You oppose political change because of fear of loss of political control. So we think is very fundamental, and in fact, it's very much interwoven with the theory of economic change, the theory of political change that John mentioned, how democracy emerges sometimes peacefully. It's about the ability of different people to make concessions and arrange the gains from economic interaction. So again, start at point C, but remember that the elite controls institutional power, de jure power, but sometimes the more numerous rest of society may get de facto power. They may solve their collective action problem. They may pose a revolutionary threat. And when that happens, the situation is dire, so you have to make some concessions to stave off that revolution as an elite. So that concession may be moved from point C to point B. The elite still controls de jure power, but that's now a disadvantage because they're making a concessions, but everybody understands that those concessions are temporary. The revolutionary threat is here tomorrow, here today, gone tomorrow. And when that threat goes, you will draw back those concessions. So go back from point B to point C. So what do you do with this? So one way of dealing with this situation is to actually change the distribution of de jure power. Institutional change is a commitment to actually making these concessions more durable. So that was the heart of our explanation, and this is what, for example, the British politicians in the context of the First Reform Act, the first major piece of democratic legislation in the 19th century, when Lord Grey introduced to the Parliament, the principle of my reform is to prevent the necessity of revolution. These frames the way that we thought about the colonial era as well as others. So let me talk a little bit about the colonial era. Understanding extractive institutions is quite straightforward. Colonial institutions were characterized by a huge imbalance of power, militarily and otherwise, in the hands of the Europeans. But limited fiscal tools for extraction that would be more efficient, so they set up hugely inefficient, hugely repressive monopolies, extractions, coercion systems for labor extraction, and a small elite ruling over a large landmass and large population. Political control was paramount in their minds. So political losers mechanism was central. So it's no surprise to us from this framework that you ended up with highly extractive institutions in the colonial era in all of these places which the Europeans tried to control, especially in the places they didn't settle. But why different in the settler colonies? Not because Europeans became with better models of democracy and implemented them, and not because colonial authorities had different designs. In fact, we documented that they tried to do often the same things as they did in the Spanish America, in North America. But it didn't succeed. It didn't succeed because the balance of power was not as skewed. First of all, the settlers could move to other places, the open frontier, in this often relatively empty land compared to the places like the Inca, Aztecs, or India. But also European colonial authorities were less willing to exact the same violent repression on Europeans as on the native population. So that more balance also meant that often they had to make concessions to the lower strata, which were these indentured servants and so on. You see that in the Jamestown colony in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Australia. First, more inclusive, a little more inclusive economic institutions, more inclusive political institutions, some legislatures and so on, and that kick-started a very different process. But if I want to talk more about the colonial era and other episodes, another concept that is useful, and I'll introduce that briefly, this is what we called critical junctures, periods of disruption because of demographic change, new economic opportunities, new technologies that create room for both institutional and economic change. And the way that I conceptualize that is something that leads to major divergences from small differences. And so again, look at the frontier. With the red, I'm showing the frontier under extractive institutions. The blue is the shift, the better frontier when you have more inclusive institutions, but in regular times. But small change becomes much amplified during these critical junctures, so that's why I am drawing in green what the same institutions would achieve during this period of critical juncture. Why? But there are no new opportunities, so changes now enable much more beneficial variations in terms of economics, in terms of who runs the firms and who invests and who innovates and so on. But critical junctures are also times of institutional divergence. If you try to increase repression in order to deal with these new opportunities, new instabilities, that's a shift inwards, that's the black frontier. Path-dependent, but also very divergent change is how we try to conceptualize it. And you see, once you do this, new commonalities, for example, between colonialism and the spread of industrialization. In colonialism, it was these small differences that led to huge variations in terms of institutions. Before Europeans arrived, there were differences in terms of institutions, in terms of some civilizations that were pretty elaborate. And there were some income differences in the colonial world. But these small differences became amplified. Why? Some relatively inconsequential things like the local diseases that didn't matter so much for the indigenous population suddenly had a much different meaning in terms of institutional trajectories when Europeans, with their huge power imbalance but their lack of immunities, arrived. Industrialization within the colonial world can be understood in the same way, but let me actually talk about industrialization within Europe, within Asia, within the colonial world. You see these divergences during industrialization, some countries taking advantage of industrial opportunities, railways, new factories, some others resisting them. Why? Well, again, small differences becoming amplified via institutional trajectories diverging via different reactions to technologies and how that shapes the path of technology. So the France and the Habsburg Empire weren't that different in the 18th century, but differences in the political dynamics make that the political losers mechanism was much more of a concern for the Habsburg dynasty, or as von Gens, a leading lawmaker, put it, we do not desire at all that the great masses shall become well off and independent. How could we rule over them otherwise? So that meant that these new opportunities were met with greater repression and refusal from the Habsburgs, and not so from France or some other countries, institutional divergence, economic divergence. And institutional responses, for example, during the progressive era, the balance of power shifting back and forth between monopolies and not. But what I want to do is to end by applying this framework to our current questions. And there are so many of them, and they're questions that we could think about and reason, perhaps using this framework, perhaps with others. But one that I think is at the back of the minds of many people is about digital technologies, new inequalities, and the age that may be shaped as the age of AI. So again, let me start thinking about this using the red frontier where we were, and imagine we were at a point like B0 where there are relatively high wages, shared period of growth throughout the 3 decades that followed World War II. And for a variety of reasons, balance of power starts shifting, deindustrializations, unions becoming stronger, weaker, and that's a shift from B0 towards B1. Now think of B1 as favoring the capital owners and the professional workers, the highly educated who become the managers at the expense of manual workers. But the key is, again, technology and shifts of the frontier. So for example, in my work with Pasquale Restrepo, we have emphasized how you cannot understand the current period without thinking of automation and how technologies have changed. And automation is particularly important because it shifts tasks away from labor, especially manual low education workers, towards capital. So it's really shifting and tilting the frontier. And that's what I'm showing here with the blue frontier. It's tilting in favor of capital owners and professional workers and against workers. That's one conceptualization of automation. So now the situation is much worse because you're not just moving along the frontier, but the whole shift is against the manual workers. But age of AI is intensifying these trends. But what I have emphasized in my work, and I firmly believe, and for example, what I have written with Simon Johnson, with Pasquale Restrepo, with David Outer, is that AI is a versatile technology. You can use them in many different ways. You can use AI to provide better information to make workers, manual workers, much more productive. That's what we call pro-worker AI. And if you do that, you can go back to something like the black frontier, which provides a chance for building shared prosperity. Wages, utilities, incomes of different segments of population can be high. But the fear is that it can also lead to the green frontier, even more distorted, but also not so favorable. This is what we call excessive automation. This is very bad for workers, but not so good for the capitalists and professional workers either, because when you're doing the excessive automation, you are not benefiting because it's excessive. You're actually losing some of the productivity. It is a good way of controlling labor. It's not a great thing for labor, but it's not so beneficial either. So there are choices that are political as well as technical about how we develop AI and how we use, which is going to be critical, not just for the distribution of resources, but the critical juncture perspective says about the evolution of institutions. If you create different types of technologies and different kinds of distributions of gains, that also has implications about who is going to be empowered and how democracy will function and so on. So in conclusion, I am really excited to be here for many reasons, but one of them is to be able to share what I'm really excited about, which is about political economy and of institutions and technology. And I think the framework, as well as the summary of the work that I provided, was meant to convey not just that enthusiasm, but that once you start looking at the world through these lenses, you see new commonalities. And there are lessons that we can draw from very disparate episodes, such as the spread of industry, colonial period, for the current age. And I think not just these commonalities, but others will be the heart of the political economy of technology and our understanding of the future of institutional divergences and institutions and technology. And I think many people in this room and many people around the world who are really excited about these issues, I think are going to make amazing contributions here. And if we can continue to be part of this journey, Simon, Jim, and I would be amazingly happy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Daron. Now for the second lecture, and this is going to be given by the second laureate, Simon Johnson. Simon is the Ronald Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management. The stage is yours, Simon.
I'm a professor at MIT Sloan School of Management, and my lecture is called Disease Environments, the Mortality of Europeans and the Creation of Institutions in the Colonial Era. If you look at the Korean Peninsula from above at night, this is what you see. There is no light, almost no light visible from North Korea. And that's because, as I think most of you know, North Korea is a very poor country. North Korea is also run by a rather brutal totalitarian regime, raising the question of, are the North Koreans so poor because of the totalitarian regime, or does the causation flow the other way? And of course, South Korea, a completely different country in terms of its characteristics, a democracy in which a lot of people are included and have rights, is today struggling or arguing intensely about the nature of its democracy and the importance of democracy for prosperity. Now, if you take this comparison between a country with quite extractive institutions where a small elite gains all the power and all the wealth, and a country that is much more inclusive, take that idea to the world, you can actually measure, and many people have done this, there are many different indices out there, how countries vary in terms of being either more inclusive or having more extractive institutions. And this is what that map would look like. So the countries have some color coding. There's a variety of experiences out there. And if you take this map and compare it to GDP per capita, so GDP per capita is not a perfect measure, but it's the best measure we have for prosperity, you can see there's a very high correlation between more inclusive institutions and more prosperity. This map shows all the countries of the world, and I've divided them into two colors. The red ones are former European colonies, which is about a little bit over a third of all the countries in the world today, and the blue dots are other countries. So you can see that the former European colonies span, roughly speaking, the entire experience of institutions today, how inclusive they are, and GDP per capita today, how wealthy people are. And I am emphasizing European colonies because when we started to think, myself, Doran Asimoglu, Jim Robinson, about the potential ways to think about causation, do institutions cause prosperity or prosperity somehow cause and bring with them institutions? Our attention was drawn to the experience of building European empires. This is a map of the British Empire, actually around the middle of the 19th century, before the so-called scramble for Africa. Subsequently, a lot of Africa would have received this red color. But you can see, just from looking at the map, the broad span of British control, the range of countries that the British managed to run one way or another for a long period of time. And if you know something about the history of these countries, you may immediately realize that some places where the British had control for a long period of time are now really quite prosperous, and other places where the British had control for just as long are now today very poor. And this is not a statement that holds just for the British Empire, although the British Empire is a very interesting, important, and difficult part of this experience, but other empires have similar variation in the outcomes across former colonies. So, what's going on here? What explains, or what's the history that led to this kind of experience? And this range of experience? Well, as I think you all know, and you probably learned this at some point in your education, perhaps even in elementary school education, from about 1500, the Europeans, West Europeans, attempted to go almost everywhere in the world. I think traditionally these are called voyages of exploration and discovery, but let's be honest with ourselves today. These are voyages of attempted conquest and exploitation, where the Europeans, who were our ancestors, for many of us, they were avaricious, they were ambitious, they were seeking gold and silver, they were interested in capturing peoples, they wanted to get their hands on land, and they wanted to, in most cases, their initial thought was, let's bring more Europeans with us. Let's try and extend the presence of Europe. And that is actually the tradition of colonization, for example, around the Mediterranean. You set up a colony and you bring people, and with those people, your people, you try to reshape the land that you have established a foothold on or, in your view, captured. But the Europeans very quickly encountered a problem, a very big problem for them, which was infectious disease to which they had essentially no acquired or inherited immunity. Those diseases were primarily yellow fever and malaria. And if you want to look at and to understand the intensity of the experience and the awfulness of what the British and other Europeans ran into in some places, you can think about the attempts to build the Panama Canal in the late 19th century, the attempts that were led by the French entrepreneur Ferdinand de Lesseps, who ignored all the warnings about tropical disease. His people were the best engineers in France, and there were many, many brilliant intellectuals and practical engineers on his team, but they had zero understanding of effective public health in a tropical environment. Epidemics of yellow fever swept through his workforce. 20,000 people died, and the entire French attempt to build a Panama Canal in the 1880s and 1890s collapsed because of infectious disease. And while the Europeans did not have a functioning theory, or even a particularly useful theory or understanding of these diseases, they did, because of these extremely harsh experiences, very quickly figure out some places were much less healthy to them as Europeans, as potential European settlers, than other places. So we have good data on this from records that were kept by European militaries, somewhat in the 18th century and very much in the early 19th century. So this graphic on the right-hand side shows one of the basic sources of data. Now, the classification of diseases is not correct. That's not what modern medical people would use. But they did understand when people died of disease in different places, and they did measure that, they did communicate that, and potential settlers understood that. So if you send 1,000 young male Europeans around the world in roughly 1800, a year for which we have very good data, we know that if you sent that group of people to West Africa, 500 of them would die in the first year. Half the people you sent would die. And the second year, you would have an equally high rate of mortality. If you sent the same 1,000 people to the West Indies or India, the mortality rates were still high, but they were much less dramatic than the West Africa. It would be between 40 to 70 in India, 85 to 130 is what the data say for the West Indies. If the same 1,000 people went to North America, northern United States or Canada, for example, the death rate per annum for those people would be about 15 per 1,000. And that's, roughly speaking, the same death rate as for people like them who stayed behind in Britain and France. And again, the military records show us similar data for similar people across these very different places. So, if we wanted to sort of summarize this data and summarize what the Europeans understood in this period, we could divide the disease environments that they faced into three groups. One was extremely high, more than 7 times what the Europeans faced. One was pretty high, so if you go to these places, you're 2 to 4 times as likely to die as if you stay in Europe. And one was quite low and really very similar to Europe. And ask yourself the question, if you're being pitched on some potential colonial adventure and you have these data and you're aware of this experience, to which of these places would draw your attention? Where would you like to move? Where would you like to take your family? So the Europeans understood this, and let me be very clear, and it's super important. We said this very clearly at the beginning of our papers on this topic, and I must reiterate this to you today, that wherever the Europeans went, the outcomes for local indigenous peoples, the people already living there, were incredibly harsh. And I know of no substantial exception to that statement. However, there was a difference between the strategies that were pursued in 2 sets of countries. In those places where settler mortality was low, where the risk of death from disease was no higher than in Europe, the Europeans established what many people have called settler colonies. So the Europeans came and they settled, and they tried to bring more Europeans. And how do you bring more Europeans? How do you entice Europeans to come from Europe? You offer them the rule of law, you offer them property rights, you offer them some political voice. That's inclusive institutions. Now, what happens in the other places, the places where you don't want to take your family, the places where Europeans don't want to settle? Did the Europeans leave those places alone? Did they back away entirely? No, of course they didn't. The Europeans were looking for opportunity, advantage, profit everywhere, but they didn't want to go in large numbers. So they established a presence, they found ways to build control, they minimized the number of Europeans on the ground, and they extracted value from the local population in every which way they could, creating what we now call and what we now see around the world as extractive institutions. If you got extractive institutions, you didn't get good outcomes in terms of economic growth subsequently. In fact, the effect of these institutions, this differential impact of institutions, was so dramatic that countries and places that were initially rich relative to the world, when the Europeans showed up, places such as the Inca Empire or much of the Indian subcontinent, these places subsequently became quite poor. The places that have become rich within this sphere of extensive European influence is places, not the indigenous peoples, but places that initially didn't have much by way of resources or much by way of concentrated population that the Europeans could capture. And the key driver of the massive differential in income per capita today is whether or not you industrialized early among the former European colonies, and that's primarily about whether you had inclusive enough institutions. This graph shows the USA, UK, India, and China, their share of world manufacturing. And you can see that when the Industrial Revolution starts, at the end of the 18th century, the United States is nothing in terms of industrial production. India actually had very substantial and very impressive, high-quality industrial production. But in the 19th century, as the modern tools of industry spread, it's the Americans who were able to take advantage of that. In fact, by the 1890s, the US is the largest industrial power in the world. And look at what happens to India, losing its share steadily, unable to industrialize because of the institutions that have been imposed and run by and taken over by the British. So if you look at the data today, you can see a very robust pattern. It really doesn't matter. There's lots of different measures of institutions. You can pick and choose. You can run this exercise for yourself at home. Many people have run these regressions over the past 25 years, and we should do more of that. It doesn't matter which measure you take. Lower settler mortality, the places that had that lower initial mortality for Europeans, have more inclusive present-day institutions. So if you look at the relationship between settler mortality and income per capita today, you get this line. Actually, today's line is the red line, the solid red line here. The line that we originally estimated from our papers published initially in 2001 is the dotted blue line. So to be clear, income per capita around the world does drift upwards over time. That's what you're seeing here. But the regression line, the slope, is almost unchanged, which means that the inequality of the ability of settler mortality to explain differential GDP per capita around the world remains remarkably consistent and soberingly consistent despite all the discussion about institutions, all the attempts to reform, all the red around institutions we've seen over the past 25 years. This regression result remains quite robust. But while this might be an interesting result for you, I think and I hope it should also raise a question, which is, you know, if this is so obvious, if this has been with us for so long, if extractive institutions are so painful, why do they last? Why don't countries and peoples find their way out of it? And I really want to have an important shout out here to some of the scholars many of the scholars who come after us and who have built extremely interesting and I think important work on to help us understand exactly how extractive institutions have persisted. So I'd like to mention, and these are just three examples, but three wonderful researchers. Lakshmi Iyer has done work on colonial India, identifying that land tenure, the way that land was held, and the rights of people relative to land has turned out to be an incredibly persistent measure or aspect of institutions that has lasted through hundreds of years. Melissa Dell has found that in the case of Peru and also Java in modern Indonesia, it's the way in which labor was used and forced labor schemes imposed by the Europeans that have had these long-lasting effects and that have proved difficult to shake off. All those legacies remain with us. And Nathan Nunn has produced this incredibly important and I think massively consequential work that we should all study and understand and think about the full consequences of the slave trade. The slave trade that was created by Europeans, it was run by Europeans across the Atlantic. The slaves were brought across South America to the West Indies and to North America. And the consequence of this slavery remains with us, both in the countries where the slaves came from and in the countries where the slaves arrived. And this historical depth of knowledge is important, I think, in part because the 20th century had many amazing achievements and if you like, medical miracles, which you might think should have changed everything. For example, this lack of knowledge about yellow fever and malaria, which was a huge deficiency in human understanding, it was fixed by scientists at the end of the 19th century. In fact, Ronald Ross, who had a couple of the most important ideas that helped precisely pin down how mosquitoes transmit malaria, Ronald Ross made those breakthroughs in 1897 as an obscure doctor working in India and some other places. In 1902, he was recognized with a second ever Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine. And by the 1920s, this is a cartoon that shows an enormous, mosquitoes are not actually this big, an enormous mosquito dropping malaria bombs and yellow fever on people. There was a broad understanding that this is how these important infectious diseases were spread. Sadly, this knowledge was not converted into completely accessible public health until the 1940s, so that we should ponder that gap between the Nobel Prize and actually making the technology available to people around the world. It took far too long. But by the 1940s, there were sustained and well-designed public health campaigns to reduce the transmission and where possible, eradicate malaria and yellow fever. And the success of these measures in terms of life expectancy, including in quite poor countries, was remarkable. So on the left here, you can see life expectancy at birth, and these are across a range of different countries in terms of their initial incomes per capita. And you can see the poorer countries converging up to the level of the richer countries. In the right, you can see, however, that the same was not experienced in terms of GDP per capita. So in the 20th century, everyone has access to not the same medicine, obviously, not the same healthcare, but to key breakthroughs in public health. That helps a lot of people, but it doesn't transform their economies. It doesn't lead to convergence in world GDP per capita. In fact, the distribution, the inequality of GDP per capita we have today in 2024 is roughly the same as what we had 120 years ago. It was the 19th century and industrialization that was decisive, not the 20th century, for that distribution of income. And here's the reason. And I understand this is an uncomfortable story for many people, and I understand there are facts here that many people, including people in power around the world today, would rather not confront. But this is what's in the data. Actually, these are data that our colleagues in Gothenburg at the VDEM team collect. I think this is some of the very best data that we have that shows what happened to institutions over time. So I'm just putting 3 countries on this slide. Not to pick on anyone, but they are illustrative. The United States is the green line at the top. That was a low settler mortality place. The blue line is India. That was a medium settler mortality place. The British ruled it, in our view, in a way that was primarily extractive. And at the bottom is Nigeria, which again was under British control and had extremely extractive colonial experience. And if I take my 3 settler mortality groups that I showed you about a few moments ago, low settler mortality, medium, and extreme, or high and extreme settler mortality, you see the same pattern. That the institutions that you had in 1900, and you can go back earlier in a slightly more fragmented way with the VDEM data, for example, these institutions, they change from year to year. There is crisis, there's a coup, there's political volatility, sure, but there's path dependence. There's a legacy. There's a shadow of colonialism, and that shadow depends on whether that shadow is entirely malevolent or somewhat good for some people, depends on exactly how the Europeans ruled you. Now, we did spend, we're grateful to have been awarded the prize for work we did 25 years ago. It feels good. But we haven't been entirely idle over the past 25 years. We've attempted to pursue these issues across a variety of dimensions, including understanding what it means for economic policy, ways in which you can actually improve institutions or deliver on better economic growth. We've also dug more into the history of institutions, including outside the colonial experience. So the colonial experience and these papers were intended to get at causation in a clean way, in a way that you could see the data, in a way you could understand the causation. But we also looked at the French Revolution. We've also looked at the expansion of Western Europe, the way in which some of the better institutions in the world, including in Western Europe, some of the ways that those were developed. And we've also spent a lot of time on the United States, because if you took our papers seriously, and I'm glad that some people did, the United States looks pretty good. But of course, the United States modern experience is far from, let's say, good for everyone, and it's far from good in every year. So we've had a major financial crisis, we've had a slowdown in productivity growth, we've had a repeated struggle to benefit from and continue to invest in science. And if I could just put these points together in my last 9 minutes, in summary form for you, and in a way that hopefully is forward-looking, in a way that hopefully drives research agendas, either supporting us or, go for it, knock holes in our research agenda and our propositions. A lot of people have built their careers on that too, and I wish them well. In summary, if I summarize the history of the entire experience, it would go like this. With a few dozen small wooden ships, some Europeans conquered the world and shaped modern institutions to do what they wanted to do. When industry advanced in the 1800s, and of course the ships became a lot larger, the structure of European empires determined today's global division of labor, or if you prefer a blunter version of that, whether you live in a country that makes computer chips and software, or a country that primarily exists by sewing other people's clothes, that comes directly out of the 19th century industrialization experience and where you sat relative to inclusive and extractive institutions in that moment. But today, of course, technology has changed even more, and we have machines, and we have ships, and we have processes that dwarf anything that we've seen in history. And you might think that if you have strong institutions, you're all set. Because after all, you're well positioned to invent new technology, you can hopefully create more good jobs, and actually, if you're a really powerful country, or a collection of countries like the European Union, you have a seat at the table to set the global rules, for example, for trade, or for capital flows, or for migration, or for anything else that you think matters. But there is an important caveat that looms large over us, particularly in this age of the emerging artificial intelligence, AI, which is being recognized this week with the chemistry prize and the physics prize entirely appropriately, because these are fundamental and massive transformations of technology. But new technology does not necessarily benefit everyone. Technology actually, over history, and this is a topic that Dron Asimov and I wrote a book on recently. We reviewed 1,000 years of history. We read the history so you don't have to for 1,000 years. You can easily find inventions, and the cotton gin would be one of the most awful, which actually helped a few people, those who were white slave owners in the southern United States, but primarily made it easier and cheaper to expand slave plantations across what we now call the Deep South. And this is a technology that was made even more valuable by industrialization, because now you could sell a lot more cotton to Britain for turning into shirts in Manchester. Now, we have had some good experiences, including experiences that centered around automation. Henry Ford automated production of assembly of cars. He brought electricity to the production line, which was a really fundamental transformation. And he created a lot of new tasks for humans to do. A lot of those tasks required expertise. But it's that second piece that I want you to focus on. Because if you just have automation without new tasks for humans, what you're going to get is a lot of unemployment, a lot of de-skilling, a lot of people being pushed down to the lower end of the labor market. And the fear that we have, this is work that Doron Asimoglu, David Order, and I do at MIT, the fear that we have is that we will now be, we are already in a phase of excessive automation where we do a lot of automation, we replace people with machines and algorithms, but we don't create enough new tasks that require skills. And if that's your focus, and if that's now powered by AI, and the machines and the algorithms become so much more potent, then the consequences of this industrial revolution are going to be much more unequalizing and much worse for more people, including in the United States, including in Western Europe. And what will the consequences, the spillover costs, whatever you want to call them, be for lower income countries or countries with more extractive institutions or countries where ordinary people have less political voice? It's a good question. You should work on it. I don't think it's going to be good. So what should we do? Doron and I work in an engineering school. In an engineering school, certainly a school like MIT, you look for solutions. The attitude of MIT when we won the Nobel Prize was, that's fantastic, what are you going to do now? And that's the right attitude, if you ask me. And so what we do is the following. Doron and David Order and I have a center that works on, it's called Shaping the Future of Work, and we're focused on understanding and trying to help promote and develop what we call pro-worker AI, which means artificial intelligence being developed in ways that will help boost the productivity and the pay and the status of people who did not go to 4 years of college. We're also, of course, focused on and emphasizing how the rapid aging of the global total population is going to create new issues and new problems that need to be confronted from this dimension. I personally would like to take some of the lessons I learned from COVID, which was an absolute and complete disaster, but yet we have the scientific knowledge, we have incredible human capital, we have brilliant people like Michael Minna, who had fundamental and important insights into what public health needed early in the pandemic, some of which we used in our work, many of which were ignored by policymakers. We need to do much better. We need to remember that gap between Ronald Ross's Nobel Prize and better health being available to the world. There's no way that 40-year lag should be acceptable to any of us. Now, improving people's health is not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient. You also need to move the ball on economics, on an economic growth in a sustainable manner, in a way that respects the planet, in a way that understands climate change. So these are difficult problems. Work on them. And use the brilliant technology being highlighted this week. So when there was a fantastic event for Nobel Prize winners in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, which I attended, with the chemistry, with John Jumper from chemistry and the biology winners. And I saw John Jumper explain how AlphaFold will transform biological research, how it will enable... I sort of interact with the biology winners and pitch them on how it will transform biological research and help creation of new therapies and new drugs. I understood nothing at all about the technical conversation, but I can tell you, buy AlphaFold. No, I'm not giving advice on buying and selling stocks. I'm telling you there's a technology that is going to transform the world, and you saw it here this morning, not in this talk. It was a little bit earlier. So go review the tape. And I think we should harness this incredible energy behind AI and the capital that's being deployed and the investments that are being made to productive purposes, to purposes that help people. You know, a lot of times economists talk about the law of unintended consequences. Well, John Gruber and I wrote a book called Jumpstarting America, which I characterize as being about intended consequences. You make 0% of the shots you don't take. If you don't take the shot on goal, you don't score goals. You need more science. You need science for a public purpose. You need to understand and think about the lives you're going to improve. Yes, you should worry about unintended consequences, sure. But if you don't aim to break through and to share the benefits of that and to put money back into communities from that science, you're not going to have the political support for the funding you want. You're not going to have the status you want for science, you're not going to have enough young people going into science. We need to redouble our efforts across all those dimensions. And finally, it turns out, and you should know this, because you should all aspire to win a Nobel Prize. I'm quite serious. When you win a Nobel Prize, you will learn, as I learned, that you are invited to donate one artifact to the Nobel Prize Museum. And I gave them my grandfather's passport. My grandfather's name is Cyril Dadswell. He was a metallurgist. He had a PhD in metallurgy at a very young age. He ran a big steel mill in Sheffield. And in May 1942, he received a passport, and actually the same day he got a visa, this picture is his visa to the United States, to lead what was called the British Armour Mission. And my father, Ian Johnson, who is watching today, and I have thought a lot about this experience and the documents, including what's in the historical record, and we are quite convinced that Cyril Dadswell did not travel from Britain to the United States in order to learn from the Americans. He came to the United States to teach the Americans what the British had learned from 3 years of fighting, so the Americans could apply that because they'd only just entered the war in December 1941. And to me, that's the moment when technological and scientific leadership and technological leadership transferred from Europe to the United States. Before 1940, the United States won very few Nobel Prizes in the sciences. Some immigrants did get them, but very few American-born scientists. After 1945, the United States has dominated these prizes, including this week. But with that great power of invention and that power over the creation of technology and that power to shape the direction of technology comes responsibility. And I think that responsibility rests with me as an American, with MIT as a leading American institution, with all of us here in this room and watching this lecture, to ask the question, what are we inventing? Why are we inventing it? Whose lives are we improving? How does this lead to shared, sustained prosperity around the world? Cyril Dadswell died when I was 2 weeks old. And his life story was always told to me by my mother, his daughter. And I am incredibly grateful to be standing here today and to have had your attention and to have had the opportunity to at least attempt with Duran and with Jim to highlight for you some of what has mattered in history, some of what has helped people, some of what has hurt people. And none of this was ever intended as a passive knowledge acquisition exercise. We want you to have some tools, some ideas, some inspiration to go change the world in a better direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. I can assure you that we have noted that you haven't been idle for the last 20 years. And we have also noted that your work has inspired so many other people so that they have not been sitting idle. And that's, of course, a key reason for the prize that you have achieved. So now for the final lecture, it's going to be given by our third laureate, James Robinson, who is a university professor at the Harris School of Public Policy and at the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Please, James.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Thank you. I was going to say thank you for inviting me, but I'm not quite... I'm not quite sure that's appropriate. Anyway, very honored and happy to be here, and a little distressed to go last after what you just saw. But let me have a crack at it anyway. Here's my Nobel lecture. It's called Path Towards the Periphery, and you'll see by the end, hopefully, what that's about. Oops. Okay. And so I'm not going to repeat what Simon and Daron have talked about the evidence that we try to provide on the importance of institutions for comparative economic development and comparative economic growth. But what I do want to focus my comments on and the ideas is to talk about what are these institutions, what do they mean, and where do they come from? And I think that's particularly important for the people in societies, who are poor and would like to do something about those institutions. How do you change those institutions? How do you do it? And of course, it's also very important for us as outsiders wanting to help people in poor countries. How do we engage in a constructive way with people in poor countries? How do we help them improve their institutions? And I think, as Simon and Daron both mentioned, we measured institutions in different ways in different pieces of our research, and I'm just going to focus on one of those measures of institutional quality and sort of put pressure on what it means. Okay? And this is actually a figure that you've already seen today, which is the relationship between the rule of law and income per capita. So what the evidence suggests, what the evidence we provided suggests, is that countries with a much better rule of law do better economically than countries without the rule of law. Okay? So I think we all have a kind of intuitive feeling of what the rule of law, intuitive understanding of what the rule of law is. But what I want to start by saying is, actually, in my personal experience, there's different ways in which the rule of law can fail. And there's different reasons why the rule of law fails. And that turns out to be very important. Okay? And let me give you two examples of that. I could do this with property rights, I could do it with other measures of economic institutions, but let me just focus on one to be concrete. Okay? So that's the argument. All right. So let me give you, here's my first example, which comes from China, or you could say classical Chinese philosophy. Here's an aphorism from Confucius's Analects, okay, which is relevant for thinking about why the rule of law fails. The Duke of Shi said to Confucius, "Among my people there is one called Upright Gong. When his father stole a sheep, he reported him to the authorities." Confucius replied, "Among my people, those who we consider upright are different from this. Fathers cover up for their sons, sons cover up for their fathers." So here, Confucius seems to be defending favoritism towards your family rather than something we would associate with the rule of law. Okay? Your first loyalty is to your family, not to some abstract rule of law. So here's a failure of the rule of law, and I'm going to argue that conceptually this is extremely different from another example, which I take from Colombia. So on the right, the map of Colombia, there's a black line around, whoops, that didn't work. Okay. I'm coming. There's a black line around that region on the right in eastern Colombia. That's the Los Llanos, it's the plains that run down to the Orinoco River. And that black line is an area called La Antillanora. So it's low-lying, it's lots of rain, water, very productive, great for tropical palm, biofuels, etc. So in the last 15 years, there's been a huge land grab in eastern Colombia over this land in the Antillanora. Okay? And how has that land grab taken place? Well, different ways, but here's one example. A law firm called Brigada Norrutia basically facilitated the expropriation of the land, violating many laws in Colombia which govern the allocation of frontier land by creating shell companies. So Rio Paila Castilla, that's a very big Colombian firm. They make sugar They created lots of shell companies with the help of this law firm to game the laws in order to acquire enormous amounts of land in the Antillanura. So Rio Paila Castilla ended up with 42,000 hectares of land in a part of Colombia where land is supposed to be available for poor people, basically, to become farmers to distribute in the frontier. So one of the lawyers, this became a scandal in Colombia, and one of the lawyers appeared on the most popular radio station in Colombia in the morning and was asked by a journalist, do you have to stretch the law? Do you have to stretch the law, so you could keep the land? And the lawyer replied, the law is here to be interpreted. Here, in Colombia, they are not white or black. Okay? So this seems to be a violation of the rule of law, and I'm going to argue there's something very different conceptually from my story about Confucius. And there's a general lesson there about the nature of poor, you could say, or institutions that don't promote economic development. Okay? And I'm going to use a particular terminology to talk about this that Daron said I shouldn't, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is, I think there's something conceptually different between this Chinese case and the Colombian case. There's some principle involved in the Chinese case. There's some kind of what I'm going to call, in the language of economists, a kind of normative principle. There's a sort of, it ought to be like this. Fathers ought to look after their sons. Sons ought to look after their fathers. So there's some principle involved. So I'm going to call that, there's a kind of normative order in this Confucian case, sort of underpinning what we might call the absence of the rule of law. Okay? But no principle like that seems to be involved in the Colombian case. In the Colombian case, it just seems to be naked self-interest, basically. If I can get away with it, let's grab the land. If I can't get away with it, okay, fine. There's no principle involved. It's just naked self-interest. Okay? I want to ask the question, since I spend a lot of time in Colombia, since my wife is Colombian, is there a normative order in Colombia? I just argued that it's very hard to sort of think about that example as something as being justified by any principles. And I think the answer is yes, there is, but the equilibrium in society mostly is not consistent with that order. Meaning an order exists, but people are playing a different equilibrium. I illustrate that just with a bit of research that I've done recently about social norms in Colombia. If you ever hung out in Colombia, you get struck as an outsider by many perverse social norms. And one perverse social norm in Colombia, which was highlighted by this gentleman here on the right in the costume of super citizen, that's the C. He's the former mayor of Bogota, Antanas Mocus. So he used to go around as super citizen. And one thing super citizen did was fight against perverse social norms like no sea sapo. So no sea sapo means don't be a toad, literally. And it's used to correct people who try to stop bad behavior. So let's say I see someone cutting a red light, or stealing something, or behaving in a socially inappropriate way, I could say, hey, stop doing that. Don't do that. You shouldn't do that. What would happen if I did that? They'd turn around and call me sapo. Don't be a sapo. You're being a sapo. Mind your own business. None of your business. Okay? So Antanas Mocus had a campaign against, said, let's be sapos. It's good to be sapos. It's good to correct socially inappropriate behavior. So what we found in our research, this is research with Leopoldo Ferguson and Jose Alberto Guerra, two colleagues of mine in the University of the Andes in Bogota, what we found is that when you play a game, an experimental game, and you allow people to appeal to this sapo norm, the majority of Colombians believe that if you correct me, I'll call you a sapo. But what's striking is that a vast majority, 80% of people in our data, actually think that's socially inappropriate. They think it's going to happen, but they think it's bad that it happens. So there's a disjunction between the normative order, which is what you think is socially appropriate, and what actually happens, which is, yeah, sure, they'll call you a sapo if you tell on them. Okay, so yeah, there is a normative order in Colombia. It's just that the equilibrium is different. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about this normative order, and I gave you the feeling of that in the Chinese case. Where does that come from? Like, how come the Chinese have those principles, and we don't in kind of hyper-individualistic Western society? Well, that could be because the Chinese order stems from a different way of thinking about people and society and people's place in society. So a kind of very standard idea about Chinese, what I'll use another fancy word here, which is ontology, which is a part of metaphysics, is about what there is, what there is in society, okay, what exists, okay? And the traditional view amongst philosophers would be, well, in Chinese society, they don't think in this very hyper-individualistic way. People that see themselves in the context of relationships and communities. You don't think of yourself as distinct from your family. You're all part of the same thing. It's kind of unimaginable to think of yourself as an individual disconnected from your family. And you could think of that as being the sort of foundations for that normative principle that Confucius outlined. Now, going back to the regression and going back to the data, you might think, okay, there's a lack of rule of law in that context. Couldn't that be bad for the economy? And I think the answer, and that's what our research shows, is yes, it could be bad. It could be bad. It could be bad for the economy. That there are trade-offs in that context. Okay, it's bad for the economy in the Colombian case. It's bad for the economy in the Chinese case. So there are trade-offs. But of course, underneath it, there's a very different idea of what's creating that trade-off. And a lot of my work in Africa in the last 25 years, I think you can think of it through this lens of trade-offs, trying to understand institutional equilibria in African society, trying to understand the political, the cultural underpinnings of equilibria. Why are African countries poor? What could you do to improve these institutions? What's the logic of these institutions? I think in many cases, when I step back and think about that, there are these trade-offs. Okay, so let me give you one example of a trade-off from the work that I did in the Democratic Republic of Congo with Sarah Lowe's, Nathan Nunn, and John Weigel. We studied the Kuba Kingdom. Okay, so the Kuba Kingdom was a pre-colonial state which emerged in the 1620s. It was created by a political entrepreneur called King Xiam. And I want to talk about the trade-off in the institution he created as a way of thinking about why Africa might be poor in many ways. Okay, but to do that, I need to tell you a little bit about African society. Okay, I use this complicated word ontology. Here's a philosopher talking about the ontology of African society. So Placide Tempels was a Belgian cleric who was probably the first Westerner who really thought seriously about the way Africans think about the world and tried to understand from their perspective, how does the world look, and in what sense is that different from the way the world looks to us. So here's Temples. He says, the concept of separate beings which find themselves side by side, entirely independent of one another, is foreign to Bantu thought. Why does he say Bantu? Well, he worked in Southern Democratic Republic of Congo amongst the Luba people, so he was thinking about people who use Bantu languages, who have kind of cultural elements in common, which comes from this historical Bantu expansion in Africa. Okay? The Bantu hold that creative beings preserve a bond one with another, an intimate ontological relationship. Okay? So the concept of separate beings is foreign to Bantu thought. It's similar to Chinese people thinking of themselves in terms of relationships and collectivities. Okay? And I think it's very important in understanding African society to understand that kind of worldview, you could say, and how it's institutionalized through kinship groups, through clans, and through this notion of wealth in people. That the most fundamental thing is people. Okay? And I always like to illustrate that with a board game. I don't know if the chemists were talking about board games this morning. They seem very keen on board games. But here's a board game which is common in Congo, all over Africa. This is an example from the British Museum. It's from Ghana, where they call this game Wari. In Congo, it's called Mancala. And without going into details, you take the cowrie shells, you distribute the cowrie shells. There's 2 players. And each player has a base, one on the left, one on the right. And the objective is you move the cowrie shells and you capture the cowrie shells of the other player and you put them in your base. Okay? So let me point out a few things about this and contrast it to chess. So first of all, the cowrie shells are all the same, and the objective of the game is to capture the cowrie shells of the other person and bring them into your team. Okay? You accumulate them and you bring them into your team. Think about chess. Chess, you have a hierarchy. There's the king and the queen and the bishops and the knights and the pawns, and your objective is to obliterate the other team, kill them, knock them off the board, and capture their territory. Okay? So I always think the difference between Mancala and chess is a beautiful metaphor for the difference between African society and Eurasian society. You don't want to kill people and knock them off the board. You want to bring them into your team because people are valuable and there's wealth in people. So let me go back to the Kuba Kingdom. Here's King Sham. This is a statue of King Sham. It's called an Ndop. And the person who formed the Kuba Kingdom in the 1620s, he's sitting in front of a Mancala board. That's his emblem. The great historian Jan van Sina called it his emblem. Okay, why is he sitting in front of a Mancala board? Okay, because it symbolizes the social contract that built the state in the 17th century. He said, okay, I'm building a state, I'm building a centralized political institution, but I'm doing it in a way which is consistent with the fundamental normative order in society, which is symbolized by the Mancala board. Okay? So this was a particular sort of state. Okay? It was a state which incorporated this principle. What does that mean institutionally? What does it mean in practice? It means that kinship groups and clans were merged with the state. That's what anthropologists call a segmentary state. Okay? In Western society, following the tradition of Max Weber, we think that when you build a state, you get rid of the kinship, you get rid of family, no, you don't. You merge it all together. Okay? So, did that cause trade-offs? Sure. Political science is full of discussions of trade-offs. I want to talk about a particular trade-off that we discovered in our work in Congo, which is related to the rule of law. So, when King Sham did this, it was a very ambivalent event. Okay? And the ambivalence of this is actually recorded in the oral history. So in the oral history of the formation of the Kuba Kingdom, King Sham, first of all, has to make himself head of a clans. Okay? He was forming the clans into a state and merging them. He had to become head of a clan. How did he do that? Well, there was already a head of a clan. He had to kind of overtake this chap. How did he do that? Well, that person who was head of the clan had to anoint him. So he hid under a rubbish dump. The head of the clan walked past, saw the rubbish, he spat on the rubbish. King Sham was anointed. Then there was a competition. They all had to get a hammer. They were going to throw the hammers into this lake, and whoever's hammer floated was going to be the person who could bring the kingdom together. What did King Sham do? He cheated. He got some balsa wood, he put some foil on top. Everyone else had an iron hammer. They threw the hammers sunk, his floated. So the oral history records King Sham formed a kingdom, but he cheated. Now that's very different from British political history. I don't know about Swedish political history. And it symbolizes the ambivalence that people felt towards this creation of this institution that could have threatened the fundamental normative order of society. And what we found in our research is that Kuba people are actually much less committed to abstract rule of law than other people. As a legacy, in my interpretation, as a legacy of this ambivalent creation of an institution. Okay, so there's a normative order there. The Kuba Kingdom might not be like modern Britain, But there's a logic to the way it was constructed, which reflects the principles of African society. Okay? Now, that's not to say that African societies are trapped into poverty by their normative orders. In fact, the world changes, normative orders changes, and in fact, it's obvious, and this is some work that Daron and I have been doing for the last few years, that any society has multiple normative orders, even if one of them might be hegemonic at a particular time. There's different ways of thinking about the organization. There's different ways of rationalizing things. There's different arguments you can use. Okay? And in fact, if you look at the emergence of economic growth, whether it be in Britain since 1688, after the Glorious Revolution, that we studied in our work on Atlantic trade with Simon, that we studied in our book, Why Nations Fail, you see a lot of what's going on there is actually a reorganization of the normative order. It's a kind of reorganization of the principles that justify particular institutions and particular ways of doing things. Okay? And what I'm going to show you is it's actually the case in Africa, successes in Africa, contemporary successes in Africa. Those too are based on reorganizing their normative orders. Okay? So, let me tell you a little bit about the Glorious Revolution. Okay? So, I've been telling this story a lot in the last couple of months, but the first day Daron and I met, which was probably about March 1992, I don't remember the exact date, and we didn't have mobile phones in those days, so I can't recover it. The first thing we talked about 20 minutes after my job talk, unsuccessful job talk, had many of those. The first thing we talked about 20 minutes after my unsuccessful job talk, was a paper by North and Weingast, Barry Weingast and Doug North, on the implications of the Glorious Revolution in 1688. We walked out of the old St. Clement's building at the London School of Economics, and he looked at me and he said, "Have you read this paper by North and Weingast?" And I had, it turned out. So we've, since then, done a lot of research, and with Simon, on these political transitions that took place in early modern Western Europe, and tried to understand the connection to institutional change and economic growth. Okay? And what's interesting at the time of the Glorious Revolution was there were multiple normative orders. So if I just think about the political sphere, there were different ideas about legitimate political authority. There was James II, who was in power, who was kicked out of England by the Glorious Revolution, who had a model of the divine right of kings. James II claimed he had inherited legitimacy and the throne from God, and he didn't have to be accountable to anybody. On the other hand, there was a completely different normative order, popular sovereignty, where people said, no, that's not right at all. Okay? If you read John Locke's two treatises of government, Locke spends the entire first treatise basically trying to demolish the idea that anyone got any authority to rule Britain from God. Okay? So having cleared that out of the way, he moves on to what does popular sovereignty look like, and what does the organization based on popular sovereignty look like? So those two normative orders, sort of justifications for how society and how political authority should be organized, they contested each other. They fought. There was a civil war. There was a revolution, and popular sovereignty won. James II disappeared to France, and William of Orange became King of England. Okay? Now, when you look at that, it was a political conflict, but it happened in a very specific cultural context. There was a reorganization of society. It was highly innovative, but it was justified as simply recreating the great myth of, British liberty or English liberty. Okay? So the Bill of Rights, which was passed the year after the Glorious Revolution, states, whereas the late King James II did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of this kingdom. Okay, so nothing original was happening, nothing innovative, just restoring the traditions of the British people. Okay, and what I want to emphasize about that is the way in which this conflict took part, using the sort of tools or the cultural tools that people had in Britain. The parts of the normative order. Sure, they reinvented it, but they had to justify it with the concepts at hand. I think you see that in lots of these instances, even Confucius, for example, if you read Confucius, you read the Analects, you see that Confucius specifically says he's not proposing anything new. He's just trying to recreate the proper way that society should be governed, which goes back to the Zhou emperors. The Meiji Restoration, okay? Another tectonic institutional change in 19th century Japan, faced with the threat of European colonialism and annexation, was a radical change in institutions, but it was made out as just a simple restoration of the monarchy back to its true position. So using the sort of cultural tools that the Japanese had to reinvent their society, to reinvent their normative order. Okay? And I think when I look at these examples, when we have studied these examples of successful countries in the world, countries that have changed their institutions and moved out of poverty, as Simon was saying, I think they have a lot of this flavor. So the first country I worked in kind of seriously in sub-Saharan Africa 25 years ago was in Botswana. The three of us wrote an early paper trying to understand the paradox of Botswana, because at the time we wrote that paper, Botswana was actually the fastest growing economy in the world for the previous 30 years. Not South Korea, this is the late 1990s, not Singapore, not China, Botswana. Okay? So we tried to understand how could a country in sub-Saharan Africa be the world's most successful economy over the previous 30 years. And I think what we discovered is that Swana political elites in the 1960s had brilliantly reinvented many of the traditional institutions and got them to work in the context of a post-colonial nation state. And let me just mention one, which is the hotla. So the hotla is the sort of traditional meeting place, council place of the Swana peoples, okay? And here's a photograph from a Norwegian anthropologist at the University of Bergen called Ornulf Gulbrandsen from a recent book of his. And here's a meeting of the Hotla today. So this is a traditional institution. We have observations of the functioning of the Hotla back in the 1820s and 1830s from early missionaries. And it was the place where people, adult males, everybody today meets to question officials, question the chief, to demand accountability, to deliberate, to try to understand what's going on. So the genius of post-colonial political elites was to take this thing and embed it in the modern state. Okay? When they built the capital of Gaborone in the early 1960s, it was in land, British had never governed what was then Bechuana land from the colony itself. They governed it from South Africa. They had to build a capital city. When they built the capital city, they built hotlas. This is the more traditional one. But who's that chap standing up there with a suit? Okay? That's a civil servant. What's he doing? He's up there being questioned, being interrogated, justifying the policy. What are we doing? So they took this institution and they reinvented it in this post-colonial state, and they changed many other things too. Okay? Another of my favorite example that I've been studying for the last few years is Somaliland. Okay, so Somaliland is the former British protectorate of Somalia in the north of the country of Somalia. So when Somalia became a nation in the 1960s, it merged. I won't start talking about that process because it's highly contested in Somalia and Somaliland. But let me just say, since 1991, Somaliland has basically been an independent, autonomous country, and it's reinvented itself. Okay? It reinvented itself. It innovated new institutions in its own cultural context. Give you one example from the Borama conference 31 years ago, where clan elders met and they built state institutions. They designed state institutions from scratch. How did that work? It worked representing clans. So the Senate in Somaliland today, called the Guti, represents 82 clan elders. Okay? So of course, I don't want to say this is all consensual. I talked about the Glorious Revolution. That was a political conflict. So these cases are more consensual, but obviously the world doesn't change in a necessarily consensual way. And of course, one of the most difficult problems that the post-colonial world faces today is there may be many normative orders in a country like Nigeria. Here's two of the local normative orders in two places I worked, in Umucheze and Leja in eastern Nigeria. And here's a quote from Chinua Achebe, the great Igbo writer. The owner of the village, the owner was the village, and the village had a mind. It could say no to sacrilege. That's the normative order. But in the affairs of the nation, there was no owner, and the laws of the village became powerless. Meaning at the local level, there is a normative order, there is a reason, there is a legitimate way things work. But how do you aggregate that to the national level? Okay, I'm not sure I have time to talk about this figure. But let me just say, I started to motivate this by asking, how do poor countries with poor institutions, like the weak rule of law, poor property rights, different sorts of property rights, how do they improve those institutions? I think the main point I'm trying to get across here is we need to unpack the logic of those institutions. We need to understand how institutions fit into the local society, fit into people's understanding of the local society, fit into their ontologies, their worldviews. And I think that means the nature of the problem to improve institutions is very different. The nature of the problem to improve institutions in Colombia is very different from the nature of the problem in many parts of Africa, where there is a normative order in Somaliland, in Botswana, at a local level in Nigeria. But that order needs to be scaled up, maybe. It could be in Somaliland or Botswana. Much harder to do that in Nigeria. And maybe it needs to be reinvented too. But that's okay. That just has to happen in a legitimate local context. And I note here, I didn't talk much about politics, but these are all very deeply political problems. And my last slide, I promise. Okay, I think I'm on minus something. What is this talk? You know, path towards the periphery. I gave a practice talk to some PhD students at Chicago, and they said, "What is that about? Like, couldn't you get a better title than that? It's completely obscure." Okay, but there's a point to the title. Okay, and the point is, that's my own intellectual journey for the last 32 years. The path towards the periphery is trying to engage with poor countries, try to understand their institutions on their own terms. How do people think about it? How do they think about the problem? How do you solve those problems? Okay, and I think I've come to kind of unlearn many of the perspectives I had in the past. And I think, you know, if I could make one plea, Simon was giving orders about what you should be doing research on. But so if I could, you know, get my oar in the pond, or whatever the right analogy is, you know, I would say this is a call for us for some kind of humility and just some kind of grasping how exciting the world is and all the variation in the world. And, you know, we're not all the same. We're different. Humans created many different types of societies in different parts of the world. And yes, some of them are poor and some of them are rich, and that's a very compelling problem, especially for people in poor countries. But what we do about that depends a lot on how we understand those institutions. So, that's it. Sorry. Oh.
Thank you so much, Jim. And thanks to Daron and Simon. Please come up. Just here in the front. Come. Thank you so much for a fascinating and inspiring 3 lectures. It's been a wonderful afternoon here, I'm sure, for all of us. And I'm so glad also that you really have demonstrated the width and the broadness of the area that we call the economic sciences. So thank you so much.
听完这个视频呢，不知道大家有什么感触？能言还是感触非常之深的。可以说啊，没有政治制度的保障，不能建立民主自由的政治制度的话，那么经济啊，就算你短期能突飞猛进的增长，技术啊能实现一个跨越，但是整体来说你就不能长久，最终啊经济政治都会坍塌。这就是目前中国经济和政治的现状啊。习近平为什么能上台独裁，继续开倒车，搞终身制？可以说这也不是偶然的，它有必然的因素在里面。那么这个视频呢，其实做了很好的一个解释啊。靠的开户的渠道，不管是美国还是香港啊，只要你有几万美元可以存在银行里面吃利息的话，那么这家银行是愿意给你免费开户的。你人在国内，它可以给你做视频见证开户。现在像美国的华美银行就可以这样做。所以大家如果需要一个海外的美元账户的，可以扫码进群啊。我觉得现在是人民币资产换成美元逃离的非常好的机会。如果到时候股灾发生的话，肯定会限制换汇的动作。那么你那个时候想换美元离开中国的话，可能就更加的困难了。好，今天节目就到这里，请大家随手关注我频道、转发、点赞，谢谢大家收听，再见。